Is it just me, or is there a new tinge of anxiety in the air? I think that we in Australia, and especially here in our own state, I think we've been starting to relax. Perhaps we've even been starting to congratulate ourselves a little that we had done what other places hadn't been able to, and that we had squashed this bug. And the new normal, I must confess anyway, the new normal was starting to relax back into the old normal, just a bit. But this last week or two, we haven't been feeling so sure, have we? The tone of politicians and medical experts has been a little bit less confident. We're aware that the second wave that has crashed down on Victoria and is splashing its way across the country, we're aware that it may in fact breach the defences of our own state. And many more of us now have loved ones and family members and friends in COVID hotspots. And, well, let's admit it, we're feeling afraid. In the reading that we heard this morning from the book of Genesis, our favourite anti-hero Jacob brings us back to reality with a jolt. Well, the parables of Jesus that we've been reading over the last few weeks have reminded us in a profound way that God works not just through the wholesome parts of human nature, but also through our less wholesome aspects. That God is at work, if you like, in the weeds as well as in the wheat. And right alongside the parables of Jesus, we've been reading our way through the cycle of stories from the Old Testament that tell us how God makes a covenant with a family that grows into a nation. These mythic sounding stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, which really, rather like the ancient mythology of Greece, describes human personality in almost depth psychological terms, warts and all. The dangerous desires and loves and lies and compromises of being human. And the Jacob saga has been reminding us, just like the stories of Jesus, that God works in the shadows of human life just as much as in the light. That God even blesses rat bags, and that God's blessings can come to fruition in and around. You said it, Jules. Takes one to know one, doesn't it? God's blessings can come to fruition in and around the conniving of cheats. This, you might have thought at the time, was an idea at the same time both disturbing and comforting. It seems that God's blessings aren't dependent on whether or not we deserve them. And a lot of the time, God's blessings come to us in ways that we didn't think that we'd receive them. But today, in the story that Alison read to us this morning, today Jacob is afraid. So here's the story to date. Jacob, whose name means heel catcher. Remember the way he is born holding his brother's heel. Jacob, the one who takes what belongs to his brother Esau by trickery, and who defrauds his father into giving him the inheritance and the blessing that should rightfully have belonged to his older brother. Out there in the desert on the run from his brother Esau, Jacob has a dream in which God appears to him and makes him a remarkable promise. The God of Abraham and the God of Jacob the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac promises to be the God of Jacob also, even though it's certainly undeserved and strictly it isn't fair. And doesn't Jacob know it? Jacob's long stopover in Haran with his cunning uncle Laban must have rubbed it in. What goes around comes around. The branch of the family that stayed in the old country turns out to be just as sharp and conniving as the immigrant branch in Canaan. And while in Haran, Jacob finds himself, for a little while anyway, on the receiving end. But only for a little while, because ultimately Jacob turns out to be the better conman. And at the end of 20 years with Laban, skips town yet again under slightly forced circumstances to head back home with more wives, concubines, slaves, livestock and children than he ever could have dreamed of. Jacob has finally arrived. He's now a nomadic lord in his own right. Except back home in Canaan is where Esau lives. Going home means running the risk that Esau would still like to get even for that original con job that Jacob has been trying to put out of his mind these last 20 years. And as he gets nearer, Jacob sends out his spies to report back, Esau is coming to meet you and he's got 400 men with him. In other words, a military force. Clever Jacob, and he is clever, isn't he? Clever Jacob rises, as always, to meet the challenge. First, dividing his own caravan into two so that, if Esau attacks one group, the other might get away. And then he starts sending gifts. Small gifts of slaves with sheep and goats and camels. All up it's over 500 animals. And he instructs his slaves to say to Esau, Oh, just another small gift from my master Jacob. It's like Puss in Boots, isn't it? It's like Puss in Boots sending the powerful gift, another small present from the Marquis of Carabas. With any luck, Esau is going to think that Jacob is a whole lot more powerful and well connected than he really is. Mm-hmm. But then comes the moment in the middle of the night when Jacob is all alone. Even the women and children have been sent across the river towards Esau and an uncertain reception, but for some reason Jacob stays back by himself at the ford on the river Jabbok. Could it simply be that he is afraid? At any rate, Jacob is clearly dreading the encounter with his brother, and he's preparing himself for the worst. Have you ever had a night like that? Have you ever had a night like that when all of your chickens have come home to roost and you lie awake wondering? Jacob can't... Is that me? Oh, something on the... How marvellous. Angels. Jacob can't stop thinking about what he did all those years ago, and then the narrator tells us mysteriously, but just almost offhand, a man came to him and fought with him all night. It's just a matter-of-fact statement, isn't it? We only gradually become aware that this is God himself who struggles with Jacob. I wonder, is it supposed to be a metaphoric or just a symbolic way for the narrator to tell us that Jacob is having a sleepless night? I don't think so. I think the story is telling us something real, that God is with us at our lowest point, but that also when we struggle, when in the dark places of our own soul we struggle against ourselves, whether we're struggling for courage or integrity, when we struggle in the darkness of our own soul, we are struggling with the God who takes our struggles seriously, with the God who risks something in the outcome of our struggles. Well, God, of course, never wrestles without a good reason. And for Jacob, as I think it usually is for us as well, for Jacob, what's at stake in this nocturnal wrestling match is his shame, his guilt and his fear. In her marvellous little book called Scarred by Struggle, Transformed by Hope, Benedictine nun Joan Chichester sees Jacob's struggle as a symbol of the spiritual struggle that we all have to endure, that we all have to undertake somewhere down the track as we become the men and women that God intends us to be. We all need to endure what we might call the dark night of the soul. We all need to endure change, isolation, darkness, fear, powerlessness, vulnerability and exhaustion. We all need to struggle in order to grow up, to mature into the women and men that God created us to be. Well, this struggle through the dark hours of the night is one which we're astounded to read. God can't win. Even though Jacob is wounded and will ever afterwards walk with a limp. You can't struggle with God, after all, and expect to come out unscathed. Exactly. Jacob, however, who seems to have superhuman strength, can't get the better of God either, of course. But Jacob, the heel catcher, is good at holding on, and he insists on a blessing before he lets go. Wouldn't you think this fellow has had enough blessings already? But according to Joan Chichester, Jacob is doing here what we all need to do in order to be healed and to become whole. Jacob knows the blessing that he needs, because in wrestling with the one who gave him life, Jacob is finally confronting the dark side of his own success. And the blessing that God gives him is a new name. Yaakov, the heel catcher, the supplanter, becomes Yisrael, the one who contends with God. This new Jacob is physically crippled, but finally he's grown up. He's no longer damaged. That's something actually you'll never hear in churches that preach the gospel of prosperity. That the wounds you get in life, the wounds you receive, are what heals you. Or as St. Paul puts it, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. The place where you are broken is the place where you are in contact with God. That part of your life which perhaps only you know about, that old failure that you've spent years overcompensating for, or that addiction you can't quite shake, or that ancient grief that you've never got over. It turns out that's where you go to wrestle with God. What maybe you've always thought of as a barren and abandoned corner of your own soul turns out to be a place of blessing, the place of deepest creativity and healing. Where you are wounded is where you go to find the blessing that only you can give. Well, like you and like me, this new Jacob is limping, but he's learned how to live with the past and also how to live with himself. He's learned how to live with integrity, with uncertainty, with ambiguity, with fear and with hope. When morning comes, Jacob limps across the river to meet his brother Esau, who it turns out has also grown up in the last 20 years and offers him pardon and healing and peace. This is actually the last time the Bible tells us that Jacob and Esau will meet. They each go their own way after this encounter, but both now belong in the land they have inherited. Actually, Jacob is going to have to live the rest of his life with insecurity and dislocation and fear, as the story of Joseph will reveal. It's what it means, after all, to be human. But he knows now that God is with him. He's found his purpose, and so he can live with integrity. It's a helpful reminder, I think, for us, as we, in our own, let's face it, bubble of privilege, find ourselves looking nervously over our shoulder at a pandemic that, after all, is not yet beaten, and that we might have to learn to live with. The miraculous feeding in the desert that we read from Matthew's Gospel is a reminder, isn't it, of God's providence, that God is with us and that God meets our needs. And perhaps you've also noticed that this story is an echo of an earlier miracle of divine providence, the feeding of the people of Israel with manna in the desert. It's an assurance that God knows us intimately and that God can be trusted to meet our deepest needs. It means that in adversity we can trust and have courage. It means that in our abundance we can be generous and merciful. It means we are not alone. We are loved, and so we can take the risk of loving. That we can depend on the graciousness of the God whose promises can be trusted through thick and thin. Amen.